Hi, welcome back to Detective Story. I'm Mike Hammond. Thank you very much for joining in again. Really appreciate it. Appreciate all the support, the interaction. It means a lot to me. If you're enjoying the show, please download and subscribe and leave us a review. Email me your comments or thoughts. I really appreciate it. The interaction helps a great deal. It really does, and helps us, produce more content all the time. Today, I got a really cool show for you. I think that you're going to enjoy. If you're a true crime fan, this is right up your alley. I've got two guests on today, Dan Szematowicz and Andrew Iden, who are very experienced true crime journalists and documentarians, and they have a new podcast out called Deviant. They have 3 episodes out of a scheduled 7. I've listened to all 3. It's a fascinating tale of a really bad, scary guy named Israel Keys, who no longer have to be concerned about, as he committed suicide in jail up in Alaska, but not until he admitted to killing 3 people, and he's suspected of as many as 10 or 11 more. He's super transient, mercurial guy, as you'll hear in this episode and in the Deviant podcast. Really tough guy to get a handle on. Very scary, very, very meticulous and thoughtful in the things he did. Moved around a lot. Just a nightmare for detectives to try and to end up with finding this guy, and they did a great job of finally tracking him down. And Andrew and Dan are doing a really cool job of telling this story and trying to sort through this case, which is really complicated. The murders that he admitted to, they know he did, are pretty clear cut, but the others that he kind of alluded to and what he think he may have done, it's a lot more mercurial. It's a tough thing to get a handle on. But they're doing a great job, and I think you'll find it fascinating. This conversation's pretty cool because some good interaction between these guys that really know, they're much further along than I am in this space of telling these stories. But, I think that the interaction was good with my life experience working these murders and giving them some of my insight back. It turns out to be a pretty cool conversation. I think you'll find, I hope it goes longer than I generally like for my episodes to be, but I think you'll find it's worth it. There's just some really cool conversation in there that I think you'll like. So I'll cut right to it. It's long enough. Thank you again. Stay with us, and I'll talk to you soon. Thank you very much. I'd like to take a moment from the program to have a real talk about safety and security. Toward that end, I would like to introduce you to my friends over at Blue Knight Security Solutions, your ultimate partner in protection. Blue Knight Security Solutions isn't just your average check your ID at the door security company. They're a team of elite detectives, investigators, and law enforcement professionals with unparalleled expertise. Whether you need their real-world investigative prowess or securing your home, business, synagogue, church, or event, Blue Knight has you covered. From risk assessment to tailored security plans, they'll ensure your safety is priority number 1. Blue Knight Security Solutions provides street-smart operators who can handle any situation. Contact Blue Knight Security Solutions today at 773-706-4920 or visit BlueKnightSecuritySolutions.com. BlueKnightSecuritySolutions.com. Hey, welcome back to the Detective Story Podcast. I'm Mike Hammond. Thanks again. As I mentioned in the intro, got 2 great guests on today who have a fantastic podcast called Deviant. I highly recommend. If you're a true crime fan, this is going to be really right up your alley. We've got Andrew Iden and Dan Szematowicz, correct?
That's right. Good job.
Okay, very good. I want to make sure I've got that right. Thank you guys so much for joining in. I really appreciate it. It's a great honor for us, and I think my listeners are really going to be fascinated by it. But real quickly, could you just tell my listeners about yourselves a little bit? Maybe Andrew, start.
Sure. I spent 20 years at CNN and HLN. In a variety of capacities, producer, assignment editor, writer, senior producer, editor, all those things. Primarily in the true crime space. I worked at HLN for a long time and worked for Nancy Grace. I worked with Ashley Banfield. And so my area was generally in true crime. Jumped into audio in 2019 when Dan and I and a third person, the three of us, put together and did the show Down the Hill, The Delphi Murders. And since have left the company, and Dan and I have jumped into the space as kind of independents now, and so that's where I find myself. 20 years in true crime, and still finding people that are fascinated with it, and really have a knack for kind of consuming this content.
Yeah, I too am been doing this for about 20 years. I've been in the audio space for all of that. And, started in radio, eventually moved into purely digital and podcasting. And, I work with CNN and Turner and public radio. Most recently, before Andrew and I started our new thing, I was at Warner Brothers and, working on all sorts of, all the different brands, that fall under that umbrella. But yeah, that's, as Andrew said, that's where we met. We, did the Delphi Murder podcast, together. And, we found that we really enjoyed telling stories together. Good.
Great. Well, you do a great job. I listened to your episodes that you have out of Deviant so far. It's really fascinating. I think my listeners will really find it interesting. So I listened to the episodes of Deviant. You have 3 out, right?
3 out right now.
Yep.
Yeah,
yep.
Correct. And it basically documents the story of this killer by the name of Israel Keys, who committed suicide in an Alaskan prison after admitting to 3 murders, really, right? But he
admitted to 3, and the FBI is pretty much 99% on a 4th.
On a 4th, okay. But he's the suspect in potentially many more. He traveled the country very, very transient. But I'll let you guys go into that. Tell me your thoughts about this. How did you kind of come up with the decision to focus on Israel Keys? How did you hear about it, and why did you decide this might be interesting?
I think that it was kind of a no-brainer, honestly. Dan and I had been obviously talking about doing a project together in a number of different capacities in true crime. And Israel Keys, to folks that really, really know true crime, he's not necessarily a new name. However, he is a new name, I think, to a lot of people who kind of pay attention to this stuff a little bit on the periphery, right? Like, we all know John Wayne Gacy, Ted Bundy, Jeffrey Dahmer, BTK, like the main guys that everybody knows about. But Israel Keys was a little bit different. And so one of the reasons why we jumped on board for this story is that this is a guy that was, at the time of his arrest, was largely unknown to law enforcement and had spent years crisscrossing the country, burying kill kits in various places years in advance of his crimes. And, we kind of take this tact with him about talking a lot about how meticulous he was, right? Like, he buried kill kits 2 years ahead of time before going back to that same place, digging up the kill kit and committing a murder. The reason why we jumped onto the story is that really what's compelling is that when he was arrested in 2012, he sat down with investigators, and for the first time in his life, he really started to outline who he was, what he had done, the level of detail he had taken to commit some of these crimes. And so Dan and I had a number of conversations about, once we got our hands on these tapes, I thought, this is a perfect audio product. I mean, the guy talks about it, and we made it clear from the jump, and we hope that it came across in the first 3 episodes. What we're not trying to do is just sit down and say, listen to this guy. We want to give this guy a platform to tell you all the horrible things he did. That's not the intention. What the intention is to give you an idea of who this person was, what he was capable of, and hopefully bring some value out of what he said by trying to understand that there are people like this in the world. If there was an Israel Keys then, there very well may be, and you would know more than about this than us, Mike, there very well may be another Israel Keys somewhere. And if we can understand the psychology of Israel Keys, perhaps we can squeeze some value out of that and try to find whoever the next Israel Keys is.
Yeah, Mike, you said, you kind of alluded to it, like he did kill himself before the full story was told. So one of the intriguing things about Israel Keys is, in the question we're trying to answer, is just how far did he actually go? And this is the same question that the FBI has been chasing since they caught him in 2012. And, we're not detectives. We're not, we're journalists. That's our training. And we're not going to pretend to close cases here. But just like the FBI and just like, many of the police that we've talked to, there are some strong suspects, right? Again, he is directly pinned for 4. That's Bill and Lorraine Currier, Samantha Koenig, and Deborah Feldman. Let's say their names. The additional 7, there are some very strong suspects, suspected linkages, but they have not been able to close them. Just because Israel Keys' MO was so meticulous, he excelled in not getting caught. And, we kind of say he was, the most meticulous known serial killer of all time. Like his pre-planning and premeditation was just off the charts. For the Bill and Lorraine Currier murder, for example, he was living in Anchorage, Alaska at the time. He flew here in Chicago at O'Hare. Rented a car, drove cross country over to Vermont, where he dug up one of those kill kits he had buried years before, and killed Bill and Lorraine Currier. And it's also noteworthy that he was different because he didn't really have a victimology like most serial killers, or serial sexual offenders, like blondes, brunettes, tall, big, male, female, right? He didn't have that. He was much more fantasy based. And so, he was more about targets of opportunity that would match up with a fantasy that he had in his head. So, it's tough to say that he definitely did this or he definitely did that, because he was so effective in how he killed and covering his tracks that to this day, it's still an open investigation from the FBI, and we're still trying to get answers.
Yeah, understood. Yeah, it's fascinating stuff. It really is. I'd like to start. This is a little bit of a loaded question, but
my favorite.
Yeah, right. Because I often say when people ask me to listen to some things, like I hear it and I tell them, well, if it turns out that he's actually guilty, then there's not really a story, right? Mm-hmm. If the whole event or the whole show is about how he's actually an innocent guy, well, kind of need to show that is innocent, because it turns out that he's guilty. There's not much of a show. But in listening to Israel Keys talk in those interviews, I'm just, you guys are experienced journalists. I understand there's a difference between that and being a detective, but like you said, there's a whole lot of crossover, right? And so you're trying to find out what's factual, separate what's factual from, especially from what's being said a lot of times, and so one of my questions, just out of instinct, because a lot of times it is instinctual. We have to follow the evidence, and we have to always be thinking about, well, what can I prove in court? I can believe or not a lot of things, but what can I prove in court? But instinct, especially after you've done it for a while and worked on many cases and done the work that you guys have done for so long, instinct does start to play a part in it. Like, so are your instincts that what I asked this because it struck me that he read, what is it, John Douglas's book, Mindhunter,
yeah.
Right? Which I've actually never read, but everybody tells, oh, it's a great book. I just I worked a lot of great FBI agents. That I didn't have a lot of success when I would go to that
to BAU
behavioral science unit, but it's tougher when you're working in an urban area like this.
Sure.
I don't hold that against them, but it struck me as interesting that he read that book. So I guess my question is, do you believe him? Or how much of what is out there or what he said do you believe? Do you think there's no doubt it seems that he killed Samantha Koenig and the Courier family. Although, did they actually find evidence that he suggested happened in that Courier murder?
Yes, they found a kill kit afterwards that he directed them to, and it was a orange Home Depot barrel, and I believe the Courier's personal weapon was in that barrel. Is that right, Drew?
Yeah.
Well,
as far as believing what he says, I'm glad you asked that, because honestly, one of the first things that Dan and I talked about when we sat down to talk about this was like, is this guy full of shit? Is he just saying things? And like, look, he wouldn't be the first, right? I mean, there's a laundry list of guys who have copped to things they didn't do. However, I do think that I certainly think he's capable of doing 11 murders, if that in fact is the number. Whether the number is 11 or not, do I believe that? It depends on the day. I mean, some days I'm like, I don't know. I think this guy just likes the sound of his own voice. Then there's other times I'm like, no, the things he's talked about and the depravity that he's exhibited, like, I'd be surprised if it wasn't more than 11. So I hate to sound like a cop out, but it kind of depends on the day. But I do think
I don't think that's cop out at all. I think that as a detective investigating, you probably go through those same machinations. I mean, this, I don't know.
And there's only the information that we have to go on to. And we have so here's what we have. We have what Israel Keys has said on tape, what investigators have told us in interviews, and about 4,000 pages of FBI documents from the time, and the internet. Right. So, it's, the art of journalism for us is to ask what makes sense, what makes sense here, what matches up. And, we see a lot of how the FBI and the Anchorage PD at the time were conducting their investigations, right? We see that in the documents, like, he had some tells, when sometimes his cell phone will go dark and bodies would show up shortly afterwards. Right. And where they haven't recovered any of them, they matched up the time that he was at some place. Could he possibly have done this? And, we see all that work that they did. Right. And, we ran down our own things. And I'm with Drew. Depends on the day. We know that serial sexual offenders lie. We know that.
The other thing that's interesting is that, with a lot of serial killers, there is the sense of glory that they all seek, right? They love to see their name in the media. They love to see their crimes covered on the news. That, BTK couldn't stand it, right? Like, he finally had to write another letter to the news station, and it wound up being the end of the line for him. Israel Keys was not like that. Like, he talks about in his interviews, like, I don't want this in the media. I don't want my family to be dragged through with this. Like, there was seemingly no glory that he was seeking until he sat down with investigators. And that's when he started to really get into it. And that's when he kind of I think that's what he loved, right? That was the glory that he was after, was kind of playing the tennis match with investigators. So,
showing how smart he was. He was smarter than them. He had to be the smartest person in the room.
Right. That's where he got his kicks. And so the fact that he wasn't necessarily like a glory hound in the traditional sense, he was like, he just did it to do it. And so, that's kind of what leads me to think maybe he did do 11 murders, right?
Yeah, right. It does add a little bit of weight to it. I agree with that. Because the impression I got, okay, he reads Mindhunter and he's got a plan that ultimately he's going to kill himself to get himself out from underneath the thing. So why not go out with a bunch of stories? But yeah, I agree with that. Then why not admit to all the other ones he did? If he did a bunch of others, and especially. And the other thing that struck me too was, so you guys interviewed some people he grew up with, right? Was that you guys that did those interviews?
Yeah.
And did they verify him killing the cat, setting the houses on fire?
For me, one of the more fascinating interviews we've conducted throughout this whole process was the one you're talking about with Jim and Desiree Smith. And so, to give you a little bit of context, Israel Keys grew up in a family. He was one of 10 kids. And this was a family that, for all intents and purposes, hopped from religion to religion. Now, the thing is, all those religions were generally sort of very isolated, fringe. At one point, there was some discussion that it may have been an Amish community, but something akin to an Amish community. They were in the LDS church for a brief period of time, and they met Jim and Desiree Smith as part of a church in Colville, Washington, that was called the Ark. And the Ark was part of a movement called the Christian Identity Movement, which the Southern Poverty Law Center does identify as a hate group. They are the tenets of white supremacy, anti-Semitism, all of these extreme beliefs. Anti-government, isolation, and Jim and Desiree Smith.
Timothy McVeigh types.
Yeah, and Jim and Desiree Smith, I should note, are no longer a part of this organization. They have since disavowed all of that. But to answer your question, they did tell us that, yes, even by the standards with which we were all normally accustomed to in that community, Israel Keyes was a bit of an odd duck. And he was always a little bit more, would push things a little bit further. John Smith said in these conversations that, they'd be sitting around having a conversation, and all of a sudden Israel Keyes would talk about, the pain that cats can absorb. And he would have these horrific descriptions of what he would do. And then John Smith said, I was looking around the table and I'm like, this is bizarre. Even us, the people that are kind of operating in these odd circles, we all knew this was weird. Yeah. So from an early age, there was some behavior that was visible, that was outside the norm.
Yeah.
But to answer your question, did they verify that stuff from early in his life? Did they verify the animal torture? You know what? That's a good question. I don't know the answer to that. I mean, we do know later in life, he did burn things. That one of his last crimes was an arson in Texas. That was actually after he killed Samantha Koenig. And he says he did it, and they know he did it because when they searched his house in Anchorage, they found stuff from that house in Texas that, he had burgled beforehand. So, he definitely, he walks the walk.
Yeah.
How much of the talk is true that, that is something that's, it's going to be very difficult to no. I mean, it's been 14 years now, right? It's been 12 years since he died, and the FBI really hasn't come up with anything new as far as definitively closing anything, right?
Yeah.
So that tells you, how much that they have to go on. Well, they say that they're continuing to put resources into this.
And I should say, just for the sake of clarity, we did make attempts and overtures to reach out to people in his family, to talk to them and see if they had some insight. As you might imagine, they did not reply, or, there was no, those overtures went unanswered. So,
but one thing that Israel says a lot, and investigators have told us that they do believe this, is that he, starting around, that time, in the late 90s, he was an active serial killer, they believe, from 2001 to 2012. And he says there's a 14-year period in his life where he was two different people, and anybody who knew him did not know this other side of him. So the women he lived with, his daughter, his family, his friends, he said there may be a person or two from his time in the army who would suspect something was up with him, but he says this would come as a shock to everyone. They knew nothing, and police did seem to believe that.
Yeah, based
on their interviews with them.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, I think there's something telling too about, and it could just be their private people too, and don't want, especially if they're very religious. But there was something to the family just not wanting to talk about it all, because it could easily come out and say, he was always making stuff up. He was always making himself out to be things he wasn't, to try and minimize it. A lot of times that happens. The fact that they didn't even do that, didn't want anything to do with it, might be telling. It's not anything factual, but I just asked that because that's the way I would go back. It's going to, in the macro, going to be very difficult, right? He was so transient, going to be, but in the smaller frame, all right, well, let's see what we can prove out. Did somebody actually see him torturing these cats? That would be interesting to know, because that's something that probably John Douglas does talk about. I know it's common conversation about how a lot of serial killers start out and work their way up with torturing animals and things like that. So that's something that Keyes would know. All right. So good, not good. That's really improper use of English language. But if we know that's factual because somebody saw him do that, then all right, now that's the trail I would be trying to follow in the micro then. And then, okay, now these places he's been to, but boy, that takes a lot of, only the FBI has the resources to pull that off.
Yeah.
Me as a cold case Chicago homicide detective, even if I suspected him of something here, I'd be very hard pressed to tell my boss, I need, to spend $20,000 to go out and interview all these people and go, to find out if all this is true. It's just a logistical nightmare.
Yeah, it's possible the FBI did verify it with the people, because he talks about some of the people who were there with him when it happened, that there were witnesses to his animal torture and his burning and his burglary.
His sister was one of them.
His sister, for
one of his sisters, yeah.
So it's possible that they did talk about that, and interview those folks. It's just not in the documentation that we've seen.
Yeah. Huh.
I was going to also say just a little bit about his youth that we learned is it appears from the conversations we've had and what we've read is that he had somewhat of a tumultuous relationship with his father. And I think that had some bearing on who he became as an adult. I am not a shrink, but just based on what we have been led to believe, his father was apparently a pretty strict disciplinarian, kind of ruled the house with a lot of aggression. And
they grew up in extreme self-imposed poverty too. They grew up without electricity for a lot of the time. And one of the things that Keyes says in these interviews that I actually found poignant after we kind of heard some of these things is that one of the things he always wanted to do is he actually wanted to set fire to a church. And I think that at some point he was turning his back on religion in some capacity. And I think that his desire to burn churches was sort of a manifestation of that. And I think that it was a rejection of all of that. He also dabbled in Satanism too.
Yeah.
At least as a hobby. He had, on his body, he branded himself. He had quite a few brands, but among those brands was, he had a pentagram and like the upside down cross and some of that satanic iconography that, you would associate with that. Like, I don't think anybody, including him, says like, yes, I actually was a Satanist or I believed in Satan. But, it seemed to be sort of like what he was raised as, that was the exact opposite of that,
And I think there was a complete rejection in some way of the world in which he grew up in.
Yeah.
And I think that may be part of the whole package here.
Joining the army was part of that. I mean, like, you're growing up in an anti-government isolationist, setting. The exact opposite of that, an extreme rebellion against that, is joining the U.S. Army and seeing the world.
Yeah. Right.
And he says as much. He talks about how things changed in his, when he left the country and was in the military, he changed the way he saw things. Things were different for him.
That's interesting. And that whole army, joining the army thing may just be also is, and I think this is probably what you're saying, but is the rebellion against his father and the religion and all that, right? So, and the other thing that struck me is, and forgive me, I don't recall, what's the time frame? Samantha Koenig was the last person he killed, right?
The last person that has been confirmed that he killed. There is very strong suspicion. This is one of the people that there's a very strong suspicion that he did kill a man named James Tidwell on February 15th or 16th of 2012. About 2 weeks after he killed Samantha Koenig. Keyes did say he was out of control at that time. He was in the area at the time, that area of Texas. And that is one of the people that police we've talked to have very strong suspicions that Israel Keyes did commit those crimes, did commit that crime. But again, they've not been able to, verify that.
What part of Texas was that in?
That was Mount Enterprise, Texas, is where he was located, which is basically, I believe, southeast of Dallas, kind of between Dallas and Lufkin.
Okay. That's interesting. What I was getting at a little bit is that the courier murder really seems well planned out, sophisticated. He really set that up over a course of time. Really, I mean, that's a nightmare of a murder to try and solve if you're the local Vermont police there, right? Because for all those reasons, he planned it, all those things.
And he didn't even meet them until he walked into their house.
Yeah, right. I mean, it just all of those, we call those stranger danger murders here in Chicago, which we don't get as many of. You know, we get the bulk of our murders are kind of over gang, drug competition, right? The competition for money. But with the Samantha Koenig murder, it seemed pretty sloppy to me in comparison. Like, he's caught on video, basically, and that sounds like he doesn't have a real good plan. He walks up to this and finally ends up, he's got to figure out to jump in the window with her, and then he kills her, and then he's using her ATM all over the country. And I'm not saying that he clearly did both murders, but it's an interesting concept to me that I mean, I guess there's a question in that. Do you feel the same? Like, that they don't seem like similar, well planned out, you know?
Yeah, no, Mike, that's a great observation. And I think that's why he was caught, right? And he'll say that when he calls it the Koenig thing or the Alaska thing, that's what he calls it in the interrogation tapes. He says, like, he was losing control. And he said afterwards, like, there were no other bodies in Alaska. Believe him or not, we don't know. Yeah. But, you know, his entire thing was being careful and being pre-planned and not killing where you live, right? Because, you know, why would, for the Courier murder, for example, in Essex, Vermont, why would they suspect a totally random person in Alaska, you know, with no connection to them whatsoever? And we have no physical evidence or DNA or anything like that to tie him to. Why would anybody go there? Right. Yeah. And so he would say, like, he was starting to get sloppy. You know, he was chasing higher highs. He was kicking up the adrenaline, and like, he couldn't get the urge to do something out of his head. And, you know, that's sort of when, you know, the planning started to do something in Alaska. And yeah, you know, then there was, even if he did that, it was still no guarantee he would get caught, and probably wouldn't have gotten caught unless he started, you know, if he didn't start using that ATM card, because the ATM card is how they started tracking him and how they finally caught him. Mm-hmm. And, you know, even if he, you know, did what he did up to that point, when he sexually assaulted and killed her that night that he took her, if he never used that ATM card, very well still could be at large right now. Yeah. When they arrested him, they said the only thing they could have charged him with, not even the kidnapping, just credit card fraud.
Yeah, and when you look back at his conversations with law enforcement, he kind of says, you know, that's about the time I was starting to lose control. And I mentioned to somebody the other day, apologies if you can hear the leaf blower outside my home.
No, you're good.
Now's when the yard guy shows up.
That's good. That's fine.
But he basically was like, yeah, I started to lose control. And the thing that he always had working to his advantage, the reason he was able to get away with so much for so long, was he was incredibly disciplined. The guy's discipline was unprecedented from the things that I've seen. Yeah. And yeah, like Dan said, like something as simple as an ATM card, like, you know, and in fact, the night of the Koenig murder, he asked her, I need to get your debit card. What's the PIN? He went back to get, left her unattended, went back and got the ATM card from her car. And so it was just a perfect example of, like, he had kind of lost his discipline and lost a little bit of control. And that's what got him caught.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's not particularly unusual, I don't think. I mean, nope. It's my experience. Right. I didn't work on serial killer cases really, but I like I said, when we were talking a little bit pre-show, I worked on, I put guys in prison who've killed, I don't know how many, it's hard to say, 10 to 20 people, but they're part of, like, gang wars, and they don't think of themselves as soldiers in a war, right? They don't think of themselves as, you know, master criminals or master killers, other than they think they're very efficient soldiers, right? And ultimately, yeah, they get away with it. And then they decide to take one chance too many, and they end up dead themselves, or they end up, with us with good evidence, and they'll say, I took this one chance.
Mike,
I was frustrated, right? And
I think I may have as many questions for you about all this as you do
Same.
for us.
I got a million questions for you.
But I wonder.
Anytime, I'm happy to answer.
Yeah, but like those guys you just described, and I also think like with Israel Keys too, do you get the sense that, the more risks you take, the more used to taking risks you get, right? Therefore, you more, that almost that sort of comfort with taking risks can get you caught.
Yeah, right. I had a kind of, I called him an informant, but a guy that I regularly would go talk to in prison, and I took 2 or 3 partners with me every time to interview him, and each one of them afterwards is like, man, dude, I don't want to go back and talk to that guy. He's creepy. But he was a really smart guy, and he looked like a bigger, scarier Mike Tyson. People in the joint were scared of him. But he liked me, like talking with me. It's his endless frustration that I can't play chess because he fancies himself a very good chess player. But he's a serial rapist, as well as a street muscle thug for a pretty tough gang on the West Side. But being a serial rapist is wise, and he kind of described that to me. Like, if I had stayed within myself, I could have done this forever. But I started chasing that, or those urges more and more, and taking more chances. And I knew, he goes, in some ways, I think that I was wanting it to end or whatever, because, he told, you guys would have never caught me. Right. And hear that a lot, and maybe right. But the fact is that he kept pushing until, he did leave enough evidence to get caught. But, so I hear that, and Keys, it could be that he's exactly that type of guy who just was out for the thrill. It certainly sounds that way.
I don't see how they would have caught him for Samantha Koenig if he didn't use that ATM card. He killed, and he killed her that night, and he disposed of her in a way that I don't know if anybody would have found her body, her remains, unless he told them exactly where she was, right? And where would we be now? Like, if he was able to, that's one of those great what ifs about this story, right? What if he didn't lose that one extra layer of control? Where would we be now with him? We wouldn't be here talking to you, I don't think.
Yeah, right. Or if the boyfriend would have come out right away and told he might have been able to pick him out of a photo spread or something.
You know what? That's a great question. Like, this is something that kind of raised alarm bells for us when we were reading about that. I don't know if alarm bells is the right word, but it kind of made us go, huh. Like, he said he didn't report. Like, and just to be clear, her boyfriend had nothing to do with anything that happened to her that night. Nothing.
Yeah, and I don't even mean to put that off.
Yeah.
It's tough. I get it.
It was just a weird thought process that he sees this person, and he doesn't think Samantha at this point is missing, like she's been taken. He got the weird text message earlier that night that was saying that she was mad at him, and they had been fighting. Yeah. So, I wonder, he later told police, and I wonder if this may be some revisionist history on his part, that, he didn't want to say anything to them until at least 24 hours, until 24 hours had passed since she'd been missing, because he didn't think police would do anything about that. That's how did that smell to you?
Nah.
Yeah.
No, I'm not. I think somebody's breaking into going through your truck and you see him. I mean, what's that got to do with her missing or not? In fact, I think most people would think, wow, this is weird. She ran away and somebody's breaking into the truck at the same time. Like, at the very least, I want to call and say, hey, somebody's breaking in my truck. That all smells a little odd. And again, not to put anything off on him. He's not suspected of anything. But unfortunately, we'll never know. Had he called them and they, maybe are able to put together a photo spread and show it to him, he picks him out. Maybe, who knows? There are a lot of maybes in there. You know what I mean? Again,
there was actually, Mike, there's a couple sliding door moments in this story. There was the night of the Koenig arrest. He sat at a red light in the middle of Anchorage, Alaska at 9:00 at night.
The Koenig abduction.
or the Koenig abduction. Yeah. And sat at a red light, and 2 cop cars came up next to him, and he had a girl, he had abducted her, and she was in the truck. And we were kind of going through the timeline, and it's like, man, there's always these flashpoints where it's like, if it had just gone a different way, we might be looking at this in a completely different way. I mean, in Vermont, he talked about, and in that first episode, he talked about how he saw a guy getting out of a car and running into an apartment. He was like, that was going to be the guy I was going to do that night. But for, whatever it was, he went a different route. And it's just these little flashpoints, these little sliding door moments, especially in this story, are it's something.
Things could have so easily gone another way.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think this happens a lot with this type of guy, where there are those moments where, especially early on, when they're kind of trying to figure out what they're doing, they make some mistakes that sometimes they don't get away with. So sometimes I think there are cases where guys get caught, or people get caught for murders early on, and had they not, because they did something silly and they get caught, and had they had a little more time to perfect a crime, might have been much more dangerous. I think you find that especially with sexual predators who end up, they kill one, and you're like, wow, or this is the one-off. I'm not sure it's the one-off. I think it's the one he made. He's trying to figure it out. We got lucky, caught him, because there was going to be many more after that. Maybe, who knows? But
that's one of the things that's always, going back to Delphi for a second, that always has bothered me a little bit about that case. So, the girls, Abby and Libby, Abigail Williams, Liberty German, they were not sexually assaulted, but they were killed in such a way that many think that, there were, it looked like the work of a serial sexual offender, right? The way, what was done to them and the way they were left, so I've always been surprised that something like that crime has not been repeated. Serial is serial, what serial means, right? Yeah. And it was just such a specific, well planned out, odd crime scene there in Delphi that it's just astounding to me that we haven't seen more than that, right? Yeah. And depends what theory you believe, but I don't know where I'm going with this necessarily, but just you saying that, kind of triggers that in me. Like, these guys like to repeat. These guys like to chase those highs. They like to, like BTK, for example, went a very long time between killings. So, maybe if the same type of murder happened in Delphi, that person just hadn't reached their next point where they had to act yet. But, that's one of the things about Israel Keyes, I think, is like he actually seemed to need more. He seemed to be able, I think, at the beginning, if we are right about the people we think he killed, the time periods between killings were longer at first, and then they slowly shrank over time until he had to be doing it more often and more often and more often. And is that something that you see a lot in serial offenders?
Certainly with the one particular serial rapist that I was talking about, that it became more frequent. He was chasing it. Yeah, I think that is common. I have a good friend of mine who investigated a guy who turned out to be a serial killer. He killed several prostitutes, and he actually turned out, really through some really good detective work. He said, I actually killed 5 women, and one of them was here, but they could not find the body. They couldn't account for that particular murder. It was all here in Chicago. Mm-hmm. But one of the detectives goes out kind of in his spare time and just starts finding girls working on the street and asking, like, hey, did you ever come across this guy? Having problems with them, whatever. And somebody finally said to him, you should go talk to this girl, because he did get attacked by some dude. And he found that woman, and she survived because she played dead. And she identified this guy, Taylor was his name, as her attacker. So he believed he'd killed her. In fact, she survived and identified him, was going to identify him in court. He pled guilty. certainly for the frequency for him started to pick up. I think those kind of thrill sexual killers, not even sexual in nature, probably it does build. And even with those ones that I struggle to categorize, these really bad gang street shooters, and you end up finding there's not that many really. Mm-hmm. And you'll have a gang and structure, and then they're all playing their part, and it's not that they can't be violent, but in general, you have a war going on. You got one or two real shooters, real killers, and then you find them, get them off the street, and suddenly things calm down quite a bit, but boy, when they get rolling, look out. Is
there a, this is where I ask you questions. Is there a difference between those guys that you're talking about, right? Like the more the gang oriented, like the trigger guys, and the people like Israel Keys who like complete disregard for it? Like, what are the differences, similarities between those two?
Well, the similarities are, I think, that kind of a disregard for humanity, and part of not to try and give too much away here, but I mean, I think part of the ability to get people like that to talk to you is to kind of give them a life rope back to humanity. You know what I mean? Yeah. And kind of slowly over time convince them that, like, I know, but at some point your grandmother, right? You're a little kid, your grandmother loved, and somewhere in there, you're still that person. And that it's a long conversation to get to that point. So there is that similarity. I think that, the difference probably is that, again, some of these really bad guys are really hard to categorize them. I'm not a psychologist either, a psychiatrist. And I have asked several, like, to help me, give me a thought on this. What's your, and it's very difficult to come up with, I think, but the difference is that they have with the gang type killers who've killed lots of people, or even mafia. You can put the mafia guys in the same category. They think of themselves as soldiers in a war, and that guy deserved to die because we're in war with them. He's going to kill me or my guys. I got to kill him, right? Or, these are the rules. Yeah. We told him not to sell on that spot. He continued to do it. So, he had to be put down, and it's my job to put him down. That's that.
Right. Well, it's an interesting point you make about kind of the lifeline to reel them back into humanity, right? And, we've all watched The Wire. We've all seen, you say, hey, man, this was somebody's daughter. This was somebody's mother, brother, whatever. I don't know that lifeline would have worked for somebody like Israel Keys. And listening to the conversations he had with law enforcement, there wasn't a whole lot of and I guess this is what my point I'm trying to make is this is where there's some difference. And that is, like, Israel Keys didn't have, I don't think there was a shred of empathy or like any of that. Yeah. I don't know if you would disagree with me, Dan, but having heard these interviews, if the authorities were trying to find some sort of, like, some island in that ocean of depravity and that island having some humanity, I don't know if they're going to find it, man.
The only thing I heard him say that makes him sound remotely human with empathy and feelings was the concern he said he had for his daughter. Like, after he was captured, he said that he wanted two things. He wanted, and if they gave him these two things, he would tell them everything they wanted to know, tell the authorities everything they wanted to know. One, he wanted to be put to death by the federal government. Two, he wanted to control what was in the media because he said he was concerned about how all this would affect his daughter and her life. The FBI agent we talked to, because we asked him, like, you guys really believe that? Did he really believe that? And they're like, actually, for that, we actually did believe that, so there was some sort of shred of humanity where he did feel a connection to his daughter, if we choose to believe that. Other than that, he clearly enjoyed what he did to his victims and the things he did to his victims. And we try to be very careful about what we say in the show.
Which I appreciate. I mean, I like the part of me that I've read enough autopsy reports over the course of my life that, I can put things together in my head, but I do.
Yeah. Israel Keys doesn't hold back in his own words. We've chosen to not share that stuff, just give the top line. But the bottom line is the things he does do really does fit the profile of a sadist, a serial sexual sadist. So, I can't find any empathy or connection to humanity in those acts.
But and this is not uncommon. I'm going to push back on Dan for a second, and that is you do make a good point about he talks about not wanting his crimes to come out because he doesn't want his daughter to find out about them, and it's like, well, if that was really the case, you wouldn't have done the crimes, So, I don't
know if I believe it.
Right. Yeah. And exactly. And I don't know if I do either. Cause and he's also, there's nothing to suggest that he ever did anything with kids or did any kind of commit any crimes against children. That doesn't mean it didn't happen.
Yeah. He says he didn't,
but aside from those two moments, which I don't even know if you can believe them, there's nothing in that man's words or actions that ever suggests any kind of normal human emotion.
Yeah. And I'll be honest, it's a good conversation for me because it doesn't sound like this would have gone quite the way I thought it would. But when I was listening to the interviews, and again, I don't like to ever question any other detectives or investigators because I'm not there. I'm not in the feel of it, and I don't know. So it's just wrong for me to say they did something right or did something wrong. But I was thinking to myself, if that's me, it seems like to me, especially the way they're describing him being creeped out by the way he seemed to be, they didn't say the words, but almost, eroticized by telling the stories. Like he had goosebumps and he would get excited, and it was disturbing to them. To me, if I'm in that situation, again, this is not a knock on them. They're there, they're doing it. But I probably would have gone a little different route and said, look, I got you for this murder. I don't really care, because I get the feeling, and it sounds like that this is not quite true based on talking to you guys. So that's to my point. I don't have enough information to be making a judgment, so I'm not making a judgment about them. It was just my inclination as I was listening to the tapes. I would have taken a little bit more of a tack, like this is his ego. He wants to talk about this. He wants to lay this out. So I'm going to just tell him, I don't care. Yeah, I'm not getting you a Starbucks. I'll smoke a cigar when you start telling me something with you, but I got you on the one murder. That's all I need. Go off to prison and spend the rest of your life there. I don't care.
Mike, we talk about the what ifs in this case. And I think what happened in that interrogation room during all those interviews is one of the great what ifs, because there was a conflict happening amongst investigators, disagreements about how to handle him. And, one thing I'd love to hear from you. So here's how this was handled in Israel Keys. So it was originally handled by Anchorage Police Department. Eventually the FBI stepped in and took over to a certain degree, but they were always in lockstep, it seemed, with the Anchorage PD and the murder investigators there. At the same time, the U.S. Attorney's Department got themselves, the Justice Department and the U.S. Attorneys there got themselves involved, and they very early on put themselves in the interrogation room. And I think one of the big points of friction and tension there was that you had these experienced interrogators and people who understood how to talk to violent criminals in the APD and the FBI, versus these U.S. attorneys who didn't necessarily have that skill set, right? And so we'll hear some of the people we've talked to have said, on the police end have said, we feel like we had him there at a certain point, and then when the U.S. attorneys would open their mouth, and then it would go off in a different direction, right? So I think what you're hearing may not necessarily be a lack of the police may have wanted to do exactly what you're proposing, right? They just never had a chance to do it because there were constant interruptions. There was no clear leader in that room at any given time. So there was a lot of confusion and miscommunication. And frankly, I think egos involved once they realized that they had this special, for lack of a better term, unique unicorn serial killer casemaker on their hands, right?
Yeah. And that,
career maker, pardon me. Yeah.
Yeah, right. Understood. I mean, I don't know if there's a question in there for me, but I mean, I'll just comment that that's not the way that we would handle those things. I mean, first of all, you want as few people in the room with a person as possible, right? Because you don't want to, even for trial purposes, you know what I mean? The defense attorney is going to make hay out of the fact that, you know, you had 7 different people talk to 4 people in the room at one time. It's intimidating. He's going to say these things, right? I mean, why give the defense that out? Is one of the basic things, concerns I would have. But more than that, I mean, I think that you do have to be in step. You know, I worked with federal agents from several different agencies and with other detectives. You know, like the state's attorneys, certainly I don't ever recall having a U.S. attorney come in because, you know, once they walk in the room and start talking to the guy, now they're a witness.
Exactly.
They can't really prosecute the case then because they have to testify at the trial as a witness. He told me this or didn't tell me that. Right. So, and that
was a big point of contention from the PD, from the police. The police can say things that U.S. attorneys can't. Just, you know, there are tactics that they can use that U.S. attorneys can't, right? Yeah. I don't think U.S. attorneys can lie or use manipulation in the way that police necessarily can when conducting an interrogation. At least that's my understanding.
Yeah. Well, right. I mean, I actually, I'm not going to sit here and tell you I know the answer to that either, but that would not surprise me that it's a different oath and a different set of standards. We can lie to a suspect within reason, and there are kind of guidelines within that. You got to be really careful about that, right? But and a lot of times that doesn't play well for a jury. And and the thing that you really got to be careful about, and I've seen cases get screwed up this way, where you don't ever want to put yourself ahead of what you don't know, right? Because if you say something out of school and the guy knows it can't be true, you're done. You know what I mean? Yeah. You're all done then. If you say, we found her DNA in the trunk of your car or whatever, she was never in the trunk of my car. They don't have shit, right? So you're done. I mean, so you got to really be careful with what you put out there and not get too far ahead of your skis. But in general, it's not a good thing to have anybody trying to even impart their will on the questioning, on the line of questioning. I mean, we're going to talk to a suspect and come out, and sometimes it's simple as like, yeah, maybe you take a shot at him because he's not buying my style is kind of this overwhelmed with common sense. You know what I mean? Kind of be like, calm like this and just say, yeah, I hear what you're saying. But that doesn't make sense based on this, right? And this, and just work towards that. Or just a lot of those type of things with really, really bad guys who are never going to talk to you. You better start find just some common ground. Hey, I heard you boxed when you were young, man. Where did you box? And start and just get talking, and then work your way there. And people, I think, wonder, and of course, defense attorneys make a lot of hay out of it. You spent 15 hours in the room talking with a person. How can you justify that? Well, he never stopped talking. He never stopped talking. That's how I justify it because, for 3 hours, we talked about the Cubs. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And how poorly they're being managed and owned. I just threw that in there.
No, I'm just going to leave it there because we'll go off in a totally different direction, and we'll talk about the Cubs for 3 hours and how poorly they're being managed.
But back to the point. You start that and then you work that thread. But sometimes other people I worked with had different styles, or you come out and you'd be working with pick one, the U.S. Marshals, the FBI, whoever, and they would say, I heard something. I'd like to go down this road, and talk to them about. Yeah, go ahead, But like you said perfectly, we're in lockstep with They know what I've talked to them about, so we're not going to step on that, right? We're not going to go backwards. We're not going to make a mistake and say where I keep saying he, but the suspect can go back and catch, because just like I click things off in my head and that's part of it. Like, wait, but you remember 3 hours ago you said this, right? And that doesn't quite match this story, right? Well, I didn't say, oh, yeah, man, you did. You said this, right? Well, they're the same. A lot of these guys are the same. They're smart. And they'll know, you know what, Hammond said this, and now this guy is telling me this. Both things can't be true. I know they don't know shit. So you have to have that communication outside of the room. You know what I mean? And I think everything you just said comes from experience, training, and just time spent in the room with those people and learning from other people who have spent lots of time in the room from those people. And I think, the investigators on the police end of Israel Keys, I think a big part of their frustration was they had all that experience. They had all that institutional knowledge. They had a method. They were in lockstep. They knew how they wanted to attack Keys in the room at any given day. Yeah. Whereas they would say that the U.S. attorneys did not have that experience. They did not have that training. What were they doing in there in the first place? And a lot of what they did do, even if they did go in there with the tactic, sometimes they said the U.S. attorneys would, pipe up and just completely derail whatever they were trying to build. And so, it's that chain of what ifs. What if the investigators could have kept him talking?
And it should be noted, there was a detective with the Anchorage Police Department who, in the transcripts, in the tapes, and for all intents and purposes, had established a rapport with Keys. And the folks that came in from outside Anchorage made it clear that detective was not going to continue with the interrogation. And so, early on, when it gets time to talking to him about what he did to Samantha Koenig, he stopped the interrogation and said, I don't want to tell you anymore. I want you to get her back in here. That's who I want to talk to. And essentially, they had to get her back in there because they needed to get all of that out. Yeah. But it was a clear instance where a detective had established a rapport with the suspect. The suspect had established a rapport with the detective. That got thrown out the window. And then in order to get further down the road, the suspect said, no, you're getting out of here. I want them to come in. And that's exactly what happened. Yeah.
So I just went through this whole dissertation about how I hate to make judgments about other people's investigations. But I will tell you, in my experience, that's critical error. They should have let that detective stay the linear point of the investigation. All right, if you want to bring the U.S. attorney in, you want to bring the FBI in, it all comes through that detective that's already built that rapport, because once that rapport is built, especially with somebody like that, it's a critical part of the case, in my experience. Again, I wasn't there for this, but the fact that you're highlighting it is that's very concerning to me, and I'm sure it was to that detective.
And some of the other
because I would have been, I'd have been like, all right, off you go with it, because do your reports, show up in court, because I'm not, you're not putting me in the middle of this bullshit. So that's tough for sure. So let me jump just a little bit, and I'm happy to discuss whatever you guys want to discuss, because I've got no time limit here. You guys probably do, but I do want to kind of. So where's Dan and Andrew at now in the Israel Keys case? Are you guys Have you flushed this out as far as you can go? Do you have a lot more work you want to do with it? Do you think that you can get answers? Because I got a feeling listening that, you may be like me and not have any budget. I'm gonna have to sell my Subaru to do any investigation like that. But I mean,
yeah, we're like that.
Yeah, right,
Yeah.
right.
Yeah.
So I mean, it does take a lot of it takes a lot of resources to say, okay, I'm going to go fly here and talk to these guys, and I'm going to go talk. So just where you guys sit with this right now, if you don't mind me asking.
Sure.
Sure.
So just we're planning on telling this story over the course of 7 episodes, right? And we are making them as we go. They're not done yet. In fact, we just, before we joined you, we just finished sort of episode 4 here.
We're not nearly as far ahead as we should be.
No, or want to.
That's
be.
it.
But
Well,
but
it sounds like a tough one to get ahead of, actually.
Yeah. But the concept of our show, Deviant, is that we're going to tell a story over however many episodes we think it should be told, and then we're going to pivot to another story of another deviant, right? So our first 7 planned episodes are on Israel Keys, then we're moving on to someone else. So all that is to say, we have 4 episodes left, 4, 5, 6, 7 that have not come out yet, where we have to kind of land on what you're asking. And I think the more we put together these episodes, the more, we kind of, because the way we work, at least for me, I think as we put together the episodes in our heads, as we order this information, as we figure out how to present it, that helps me at least kind of order things in my head as to what is actually true here. And after going through all these documents and listening to all these interviews, I think like Andrew and I are in agreement on some possible victims. I mentioned one of them earlier, James Tidwell. And there are others that I think we're both still unsure of, and we may not be sure about or have a strong take on until we actually get to telling that story. Right.
Yeah, right.
So I hope that's not a wishy-washy answer, but we're still in process.
No,
we're still in process as we figure it out. But
yeah, no, I think it's totally fair.
Well, and yeah, like Dan said, we're gonna go as far as we can go, as long as we are serving the story. Sifting through the thousands and thousands of pages of FBI documents kind of didn't change my mind, but kind of made me realize, oh man, there's a lot more here than I originally anticipated, because we were reading witness statements about, oh, I saw him. We were reading witness statements about people who are like, oh, I absolutely saw Israel Keys. He was outside of Taco Bell. I'm just kind of making something up here, but it was completely random of like, oh yeah, I saw him coming out of the woods once, and it was not far from where someone had been killed 3 months or 3 weeks earlier. Like, my God, talk about the tip of the iceberg here of like, to understand what he really possibly could have done. Like, I don't even know where it ends, honestly.
Here's what we didn't do, at least not yet.
Which is just as important.
Yes. We did not pull names out of thin air or like based on internet research or web sleuthing. Every name that we are considering as a possible victim of Israel Keys, we found or deduced from redactions from FBI documentation and the interrogation tapes. Nice. So we're not trying to, we're not out to get out over our skis about it could have been this person. Like if the FBI thinks it could be this person, that's a good start for us.
Yeah. Yeah. That makes sense. I mean, it is. And I think if in the course of you guys researching this, doing your investigation, if you can establish what you believe is a pretty reasonable timeline, which I understand would be very difficult for him, and you already kind of have a rough map of where he's been, but you start to solidify that will help. I mean, one of the things I learned working in the cold case homicide unit is I traveled quite a bit and because, you look at case 30, 40, 50 years old, witnesses and everybody, potential offenders have spread all over the country, and we were supported by federal grants. So we had more resources to do that. I did find that there are you tend to I think everybody, like, this is probably true in your business too, like, we think that we're pretty good homicide detectives. I know I worked with some unbelievably good homicide detectives, but I found as I meandered around the country, there are really good detectives all over the place that are really hungry to get answers and really good at finding that out. So I think that you will find, and I know you don't have unlimited time either, and you got to move on to the next thing at some point. But the more you can establish where he was and where he'd been through, then I'll think you'll find some of these police departments will be great resources to say, hey, just so you're aware, we think this guy was in your town. This is who he was. You may have, you might want to just take a look and see if you've got cases that are that might match, because there are people out there that want to answer these questions, and they want, contrary to, I think, what we get sold a lot, you want the right person, right?
Yeah.
We don't clear cases just to get them solved.
Right.
You do that, and then one, potentially, it's not the real killer still out there. So, but I'm just putting that out there. You might be able to help some detective.
That's a great thought. Yeah, we sort of did it the opposite way somewhat at the beginning, because there are all these names out on the internet, and the Wikipedia or people or web sleuths think that Israel Keys killed this person or he was connected with this person. And the first thing we did is our due diligence is we called those police departments that were investigating those particular homicides, and for I think every one of those names that is out there publicly, it was some variation of, no, it wasn't him. We eliminated him. He is no longer a suspect. We have someone else that is a strong suspect of ours, but we have not filed charge. It was all some sort of variation of that, yeah. Which is, what we should really update those Wikipedia pages for people, just
right. I'm dealing with that right now. I'm helping a guy there's been a series of murders here in Chicago, and that's just exactly it. The web sleuth have taken off with it, and it's like, okay, I can eliminate 20 of these cases right off the top because there's different DNA. They're logistically, It's impossible, right? Like, so let's, and this theory that, we don't want to say there's a serial killer, we don't want to say this or that, we don't want to cause at our level, none of that matters. In fact, it's easier if it's one person, right? Instead of looking for 10 different people, if it turns out it's one. But you want to be able to show in a court of law, or even if they're dead, you want to be able to put it together enough to be convinced it's them.
I think one of the difficulties with Israel Keys is that very rarely are bodies or remains actually found. That's one thing he was pretty meticulous about, was burying them deeply in a lake or dissolving, or finding a way to get rid of him. So, I think that's one of the very difficult things about closing those cases. You don't have a victim, the remains of a victim. So, even with the amazing DNA technology that we have today, it's going to be very difficult to pin on anything unless you can find your victim.
I get it.
Yeah.
And that's one of the great frustrations of this job. And I'm sure you guys feel this, is you do it because of this like burning desire to get answers. It is about justice. But in the end, you just want to know what happened. And you have to come to terms at some point with the fact that you're not always going to get all the answers you want, unfortunately. And that's just the way it is,
Yeah.
It sucks.
Yeah.
But,
And I learned relatively early on doing this job and like doing crime news and true crimes. I learned relatively quickly that like most of the time you're not going to get all the answers. And, sometimes you just got to deal with it, and it's maddening, but we're doing our best.
Yeah. Right. And, you're solidifying a trail that was pretty wide open, and looking at it from a different viewpoint. And that's a good thing as you lay this out. I appreciate how kind of careful you guys are being in your kind of the release of the information, and you're trying to verify everything you can do. You're thinking about the victims' families in terms of how much you're going to put out there of what he said. All of that speaks to me because, to me, it's always about the victims and victims' families. And I kind of do the same. Like there are times, especially with open murders, like, okay, I gotta, if I'm trying to get people to help me solve this murder, I have to kind of lay out some of it, right? That might be ugly for the family to hear, but that's part of the gig, unfortunately. But I appreciate the way you guys are handling it. And I think for my listeners, like listen to the first 3 episodes, and I think you're going to be hungry, for the next 4. It is a fascinating case, and you guys are doing a really good job of flushing out what is a really, just as you point out, the guy's so mercurial, just so difficult to put things together. And I hear, so I'll backtrack a little bit and give a scratch to those FBI agents and detectives there that were able to put together what they were able to put together, because he made everything difficult. It sounds like.
Yeah, even like the victim count, the FBI thinks it's 11 because a couple months before he committed suicide, he killed himself in prison, and he was only in custody for about 8-9 months before he killed himself. During a check of his jail cell, they found this painting that he'd made of 11 skulls painted in his own blood with the message, "We are one," also painted in his own blood, which is why the FBI thinks that his true number is 11.
And one of the things that I think about all the time is that in this space, true crime, usually it's like there's a case, there's a perp, there's a suspect, there's a victim, there's a short amount of time and a location. The sheer volume of the Israel Keys case, from victims to geography to time to, everything about
he traveled so.
I've never seen travel like this for just someone who just had a job as a carpenter. It was incessant. It was constant.
He robbed banks too. Like we know he robbed banks, and we have pictures of him robbing banks.
But just the volume of things. 20 plus hours of interrogation, 4,000 pages of FBI documents, like close to 15 years of witness statements from people who may have seen him, and all over the country. It's just the volume
so
of
it. Could
it.
have been anyone, anywhere, right?
Yeah,
right. Yeah,
it's just it's a huge, huge story, and it's we're doing our damnedest to try to take a bite out of it, and I hope it.
Well, you're doing a great job of at least highlighting all those things, because you never know. You just never know. And I realize this with cases 50 years old. Like, you keep their names alive out there, right? You keep talking about them. You keep talking about the cases, and you just never know. It's shocking sometimes how bouts of conscience will come over people, or, I didn't want to talk about this before, but the only way that happens is if you continue to talk about the cases.
And a seemingly small piece of information jogs loose in someone's memory, right? That's why at the top of every show, we give the place to give tips if something's occurring, if something's hitting you here, right?
And
they're still looking at it.
And Agent Jolene Godin of the FBI said to us, and it's in the show somewhere, she's convinced that there are people that have information that will be able to solve more of the case of Israel Keys. And when she says that, she's not implying that people have information they're withholding. She just knows, she's like, and I'm paraphrasing, she's like, people have information they don't know they have.
Right.
That's going to get us closer to figuring out the full scope of this guy's life.
I agree with her on that. It just makes sense, right? And a lot of times, it's just, you don't know what you don't know. And that's why, what you're doing is such a cool thing, because, my guess is she's probably pretty supportive of what you're doing, right? Because,
she talked to us.
Yeah. Right. Well, that tells you something in itself. Right. So, because, that's the only way that happens, is somebody hears it and thinks, oh, you know what, I didn't think anything of this, but now this strikes me as odd, exactly as what she's describing there. And I would agree with her. I'd agree that as all overwhelming as all of that is with him, the logistics and all of that, the variety of crimes that he did makes it so unusual and complicated. But also, though, that opens him up to a lot of exposure. And whether that exposure ever comes back to lead to anything, don't know until you know. It's just that simple. All right. Well, I don't want to keep you guys all day. This has been a really fascinating conversation. I really appreciate you guys coming on.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thank you so much. That was I really enjoyed that. Thank you.
Yeah, my pleasure. And again, the podcast is Deviant. And we've got 3 episodes out now. Now's a really great time to catch up. You guys have done it, in my mind, perfectly. They're about 35 minutes each and full of information. I think you'll really find it interesting and be hungry for more, as I am. So, again, I appreciate it. Good work, man.
Awesome.
Thank you so much, Mike.
Hi. So there you have it. Again, kind of a long conversation, but pretty fascinating stuff to me. I hope you found it the same way. Really interesting conversations with Dan and Andrew, 2 sharp guys that really know what they're doing in this space. As to Israel Keys, he's dead, so he's a footnote to history as far as being a human being who really cares. What matters is, the victims and the victims' families. There are cases that, Andrew and Dan are going to continue to work on. They've got, as they said, 4 more episodes to come. I encourage you to listen to get caught up on the 3 that are out. Really interesting stuff. Israel Keys is a scary, scary dude. It is almost endless to think of the things he may have done. And I think we may be finding out for years things he was responsible for, murders and other crimes. So, it's an interesting interactive thing with this. Again, he's gone, so problem solved with that goof. The only shame of it is, maybe he might have told more stories, but that was his control. He decided I think he had a plan, and he was going to give away as little as possible, try to play the smart guy, and then never going to take responsibility, right? Take his own life. And those are all my opinions. Sometimes, frankly, in this life, you can look at criminals and have a begrudging respect by their level of professionality, sometimes even their compassion inside of the crimes they commit. It's not unheard of, to say, this guy was a bad guy, but at least, or they were a bad person. At least Israel Keys, I got none of that for him. He was certainly a calculating guy. He certainly covered a lot of territory, but he was a sexual predator, just evil, mean, no redeeming qualities that it seemed like at all. He does have a daughter out there, I guess he's very concerned about. And if she ends up hearing this, I hope that the message gets across to her. His life is not yours. You're your own person. Go live it, find joy. He's got nothing to do with you. So I won't keep this forever. Thank you again. Keep up with Deviant. It's really good. Those guys are very thorough. I appreciate the work they're doing. Have any questions for me, comments? Please always reach out for me. It's the best way to get me is at my email, which is just mike@detectivestory.net. And stay with us. We really appreciate your interaction. We got some really interesting stuff coming up. We've got some, we're going to start looking at some open murders here, Chicago, and see if we get some more stuff done with those. help the detectives who are still out there overwhelmed, trying to get stuff done. And as these cases get older, it gets harder. But we're not going to forget, right? We're going to keep victims' names alive. We're going to keep checking in on the victims' families, and that's the action here. So thank you again. Please stay safe, watch out for yourself, and watch out for each other. I'll talk to you soon. Thanks.